Now, I watched a really good Tom Nicholas video the other day. I will put the link in the description for you. And it was about how think tanks and the people who are part of these think tanks shapes the way in which the media reports the news, right? And the way in which that certain narratives will get spun by members of think tanks to be able to move public perception into a certain way, right? What is a think tank, you may ask, right? So a think tank is essentially just a group of, the vast majority of them are just kind of neoliberals at the end of the day. They're all, the people who have the money to funnel into a think tank are just rich people who only benefit from neoliberal policy reform anyway, regardless. But I digress. A think tank is basically just groups of so-called experts who put out policy proposals that then get discussed either in the media or discussed by or given to parties with which to be able to implement in future governments, right? So, for example, this person who we're going to be covering today, this think wank, that's what we're going to call the segment when I put it up on YouTube, is she's called Emily Carver, and she works for the IEA, and she's a media officer for them, and they explicitly state on their Twitter profile that they are a free market based think tank, right? So you know what that means. It's literally just make sure government don't do stuff because government do stuff is socialism, right? That's the level of kind of political analysis they engage in. They're so kind of ideologically captured that anything that might benefit the poor is just shown through a lens that anybody might not like, right? So who would have thought that a massively multinational investment funded news program like GB News might hire someone like this person called Emily Carver from this particular think tank to want to be able to present their news program? I wonder, may she or may she not want to be able to use this platform to agitate for the needs of the moneyed class who engage in the neoliberal policy wonking from these think tanks? I wonder. Anyway, she's covering for Darren Grimes. We've got a big load. There's an hour-long program, so there's plenty of content for us to get into. We're going to analyze the kind of stuff that she says, the narratives that she might be using this to spin to be able to benefit the kind of people who pay her bills and the kind of people who pay GB News' bills. I have some sources that might come up later. I'm pretty sure that they will, but I digress. Let's have a look. Let's critique it, and let's see what she has to say about this kind of stuff.
Welcome to Real Britain with me, Emily Carver. Thank you so much for tuning into my first ever TV show. Thanks so much. I hope you'll enjoy it and stay with me for the hour. So here's what's coming up on the show. Sadiq Khan has been visiting some weed farms. Peter Hitchens will tell us why he thinks the Labour mayor will ruin London if he legalises cannabis and why it's high time for an even tougher drug policy. But do Brits agree? The polls suggest we don't. Also, is the Human Rights Bill a gift to lefty campaigning lawyers, terrorists and criminals, or a fundamental line of protection in any democracy? We'll have the debate.
You gotta love that, like, the ridiculous framing here, where it's literally just like, is it part of this massive, huge narrative that we've tried to spin as the right-wing media for months and months and months? Is this not the case? The human rights is just lefty red tape making our society worse for the sake of some woke council culture, lefty snowflake, pinko commie Marxists? Or is it the thing that it definitely is, which is a way with which to protect people in any functioning democracy? Leave it up to you to decide.
And Baroness Claire Fox will join me to explain the new Brexit Freedoms Bill and why the UK still hasn't got rid of the mountain of EU law we all live under more than 5 years after Brexit. Where's that bonfire of red tape we all were promised? That's what we're talking about for the next hour. I'd love to know your thoughts. Please do get in touch on my first ever show here at GB News. Tweet me at GB News, or you can email me on gbviews.
Yeah, literally, just like Darren Grimes. Like, he's obviously, I've covered him before, and Darren Grimes is literally the fucking worst news pundit. I hate him so much. And imagine your claim to fame from like a celebrity perspective. It's just saying, yeah, I was the understudy for Darren Grimes. That's how bad I am. Put on my CV. I am literally the substitute teacher who gets laughed at by the class in replacement for the crafty wank himself, Darren Grimes.
At gbnews.uk. Remember, you can watch us online too, on YouTube, so have a look over there. And don't forget Facebook. You'll find lots of brilliant content on the GB News page. Thank you very much for joining me. Let's have some fun.
Are you supposed to be a news programme? I didn't realise the news was meant to be fun. But I guess that's just the world that we live in. It's not it's not who, why, what, where, and how. It's whoa! That's the big W.
Have you fallen out of love with our NHS? For decades, we've been told our health service is the envy of the world, that whenever we can't get an appointment or are left on a waiting list for days, weeks, months, years even, that it's only because we're not putting enough money into it. If only the...
Yes. That's literally the case. Oh, shit. Droidcam stopped working. Just at the start of the actual segment that I wanted to get into, Droidcam decides to start fucking up. But let's restart. The camera's working, but I'm gonna restart that a bit. God, this segment's gonna take so much fucking editing. Oh, I hate editing so much. Right, let's restart this segment.
Look over there, and don't forget Facebook. You'll find lots of brilliant content on the GB News page. Thank you very much for joining me. Let's have some fun. Have you fallen out of love with our NHS? For decades, we've been told our health service is the envy of the world, that whenever we can't get an appointment or are left on a waiting list for days, weeks, months, years even, that it's only because we're not putting enough money into it. If only the government weren't so tight-fisted and penny-pinching, all its problems would be solved. Then...
Yes, that is the correct case. That is what is true. The Tories have explicitly underfunded the NHS. When you look at the difference between the funding for the NHS under Labour and the difference in funding for the NHS under the Tories based upon the growth of the population, you will see that the Tories have underfunded the NHS. That's literally just the fact of the matter. That is literally the case of what's happened under the NHS between these two governing parties, right? I am no Blairite, I'm no New Labour fan, but if there's one thing that did happen under the Blair government is they put money into the NHS and we got better health outcomes because of it. That's literally just explicitly the case. Anybody who tells you anything else is lying to your face for pernicious reasons. And I wonder why someone from GB News and the IEA, right? I wonder why someone who believes in neoliberal free market reforms, right, might want to construct the narrative that the public nature of the NHS might be bad. I wonder why they might want to put forward that information to people. I wonder why that might be the case. Well, it unfortunately turns out that the hedge fund that helps fund the activities of GB News, who pays her fucking bills, literally in February last year, dropped £400 million on investments in private healthcare providers. That's a little bit odd, isn't it? I wonder why you're trying to undermine the existence of a public NHS whilst working for a company who has a financial incentivization to want to make people undermine the existence of a public NHS. The people who would stands to profit from the NHS moving more of its functionality towards the private sector. Why on earth would you be trying to spin that narrative? Someone join the dots here, because I really don't know why that possibly might happen. Odd, that one, isn't it?
We're told the only other option available to us is the system in America, a country where millions are left sick and untreated if they can't fork out for private insurance. We're told that we should be grateful simply for its very existence.
The issue is that we actually spend, because the NHS is so underfunded, right? Because it's been left so barren by a very transparent conservative agenda to underfund it to the point of it being unusable, so that they can excuse themselves to privatize it, right? It's because they've done that we have such poor healthcare outcomes that we have at the moment, and why people have to fork out as much on almost as much on private healthcare costs as the US does right now. I'll pop the graph up when I do the editing, right? That we are looking at a crisis in the reason why which people are going to have to go to things like GoFundMe to pay for healthcare bills for treatments that aren't getting provided because the NHS is short-staffed. I am one of those people. I have to pay for my hormones privately because the NHS, the waiting list to actually get even something basic like appointments at a gender clinic are fucking 18, 24, 30 months long at the NHS, right? It is a damning indictment of its operational capacity. And the reason is it's obvious that the reason is just it's not been given enough money. It's very simple. You can just look at the funding figures and it will tell you exactly what's happened. It's very, very simple.
Principles of the NHS were to be universal, high quality, equitable, comprehensive, free at the point of delivery and centrally funded. Can we honestly say our NHS is staying true to these principles? If people are waiting months and years for routine operations, is the NHS still universal? Universally inadequate, perhaps, unless you happen to have won the postcode lottery.
Perhaps. Maybe.
lottery. Is it high quality? Well, not if we judge it on its record of keeping people alive. We consistently rank near bottom in the category for patient outcomes compared with other developed countries. Is it equitable? With nearly 6.4 million people.
Depends which developed country that you might be talking about there. It's interesting how she is reticent to mention which other developed countries that she might be comparing that to. I don't know, maybe countries that actually fund their fucking healthcare programs. Very, very simple. Like the vast majority of countries in, especially within Europe, right, have fully taxpayer funded healthcare services that are also still free at the point of use, who still get better health outcomes than we do. I wonder why that might be. Is it because of a decade of complete mismanagement under the Conservative Party? You're explicitly trying to kneecap it for the excuse to turn it to be able to privatize it, that they've been continually doing, which has been continually being done both in this government and under the Blair government, as well as Andy in chat rightly points out due to PFIs, right? Just to say that it's broken because we're getting poor outcomes, that's not a proper justification, right? That's not a proper explanation of the issues that we're having with the NHS right now.
People, a staggering 1 in 9 of the population, stuck in queues for routine treatment in England. I'm not so sure. 306,000 people have been waiting for more than a year for their operation. Freezing.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Rosa, in chat. But the postcode lottery is a thing because UK has ridiculous regional inequalities, which is very, very true, which is incredibly true, and is even more widely pronounced under a Conservative Party that continually kneecaps local authorities' ability to spend on things to benefit the community, right? And also, our overall public health has dropped because the actual, public health outcomes have also dropped as well, because people on the lowest rung of the ladder have no choice but to not be able to engage in behavior that is within their own health needs, because they're so poorly, they're not well off at all, right? Because of the economic hardships they go through, it's affecting their health, it's affecting their mental health, right? And this is a cyclical problem which exists under, unfortunately under neoliberal capitalism, which is what she explicitly tries to shill for.
Prescription charges, as announced today, won't make up for that distress of not knowing when you'll be treated. Is it comprehensive? Well, if you've tried to get a GP appointment recently, I don't think so. And as former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt...
Maybe we shouldn't have left a single market which allowed people from other countries who are trained in medicine to come to our country to be able to staff our hospitals. Isn't it funny how removing ourselves from that common agreement has kneecapped our ability with which to be able to hire additional nurses and doctors? It's funny, that also has led to a bunch of people leaving the country who were previously from the European Union to go study medicine elsewhere because they don't feel like they're even welcome, and because the NHS is deteriorating, right? Explicitly a managed deterioration by the Conservative Party.
Describes in his new book, the NHS was at times a rogue system under his leadership, suffering from a cover-up culture which led to tragic and avoidable deaths. But is it...
This was the man who explicitly, before being in government, had written a book about why the NHS should be privatised. It's so transparent. You're absolutely right. It's very, very clear that she has an agenda.
Still free at the point of delivery? Well, yes, it is. But according to a recent survey, 85% of patients on NHS waiting lists have paid for or are considering private medical treatment. That's hardly a sign of resounding success on that front. But hey, at least it's remained centrally funded. Yes, the pandemic has a lot to do with the extreme backlogs the NHS is now facing. It was plain for all to see that from March 2020, the NHS became a COVID service rather than a health service. But to blame...
Would you like to provide any statistics or data to back up that point there, or are you just gonna say that it's explicitly true? I don't have that data. I can't tell you exactly what the amount of people who treated for COVID or treated for other things during the pandemic. I got plenty of treatment for things that were not COVID related during the pandemic, right? But I didn't have the numbers, and she clearly doesn't want us to know the numbers. Otherwise, she would have actually broadcasted those numbers to us, like she did with all the rest of the points that she made. So I wonder what she's trying to hide with that.
The backlog on COVID would be a lie. Even before the pandemic, England waiting lists were at a record high of 4.4 million. And we still weren't brilliant at keeping people alive then either. Last year, the NHS budget reached in excess of £170 billion. So, if we want to increase it, where on earth does that money come from? And
the money that we otherwise spent on increasing our military infrastructure, the money that we otherwise spent on Serco, the money that we otherwise spent on paying huge amounts of crony PPE contracts. The money that the central government wastes in plenty of other areas that we do not need to spend. Or from, I don't know, raising taxes on the most wealthy people in the world, the most wealthy people in the country, maybe. How about we do loads of these things that we can do to find the money to fund the NHS, right? Even if, or just go full MMT and just realize that, the government is explicitly going to be the ability where they can just make money out of the net, right? And then use fiscal policy to be able to counteract the issues with the additional money supply. Very simple.
And the system, it isn't serving those within it either, unless you happen to be part of the managerial elite. Then you're quite likely to be earning.
What does the managerial elite have to do with anything?
More than the Prime Minister. Or perhaps you've got on board with the diversity and inclusion industry and bagged yourself a 60k job for telling people to check.
Right, okay, so we're spending £120 billion a year, which you say is too much to be spending for public expenditure on the NHS. And now you're complaining about someone who earns £60,000 a year, which, to be fair, is a lot of money. It's triple my fucking salary, right? That's a lot of money to be spending. But in the grand scheme of things, with regards to the black hole of funding that's not been properly funded by the Conservative Party because of a decade of austerity, as Rosa puts in chat, quite rightly, why? Oh, it's almost like they are explicitly using emotive language and culture war issues to obfuscate the fact that the actual economic policies that they're trying to push forward here don't fucking work, right? It's like, oh, well, we have to defund the NHS because otherwise they might have diversity, and we know that triggers the boomers within people who watch this fucking shit, right? So obviously we know that, I understand that, obviously, their viewership is going down. I'm giving them extra exposure by covering this, right? But I don't think any of my 850 odd subscribers are going to really go out and watch more GB News because of this, especially considering my scathing critique of what they're engaging in here. But even so, right, it's very, very clear that whether or not they have a diversity or inclusion officer is completely irrelevant as to whether or not we're getting the standard of care and is getting the funding that it needs. One person who works for 60k is fucking flying in the ointment compared to the billions that more we need to be spending to be able to make sure that we're getting the world standard of care that the NHS is known for, that we had for a very, very long time before, I don't know, the Conservative government got into power. Strange that.
Their white privilege. For hard-working doctors and nurses, the system isn't serving them either. Why does our establishment suddenly become Little Englanders when it comes to health? Some on the left may like to pretend that it's a binary choice between the NHS or the evil US system. It's not. There's a whole...
I mean, don't involve private markets. The demand is inelastic. Stop it.
Whole wide world out there. Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany and Israel all achieve universal access to high-quality healthcare, but they do this through a social health insurance model. We've now got the highest tax...
Interesting. You explicitly chose the very few countries who have that model, rather than just choosing the huge wealth of other countries who have even better health outcomes. Places like, I know, fucking Norway, places like Denmark, right? Who have much better health outcomes than we do with universal healthcare systems. Because they're, it's funny that they're properly funded. I wonder why that might be.
Burden since Clement Attlee's socialist post-war government. It was reported today that 2.5 million more taxpayers will be dragged kicking and screaming into the top two tax rates by the next election. At the same...
Good, I hope they do. That sounds excellent and based. That sounds red-pilled. But great. Bring on the extra tax bands for the high earners. That sounds good to me. It will reduce aggregate demand. Well, it might be able to tackle inflation by engaging in more taxation.
Same time, we're facing the biggest squeeze in our living standards since 1956. Sure, we could continue to pour record amounts of money into the NHS. It might even improve things a bit, but patience...
Yeah, we could do this thing that's always worked forever in every country in the world who's ever done that with their public healthcare systems. We could do that thing that's incredibly proven to work, but why don't we do the thing that my paymasters want because they've just invested loads of money into private healthcare? Why have you not maybe try this thing, which when we look at from every other country that even tries it with regards to like a private healthcare model, as with again, obviously she's explicitly said that maybe it doesn't have to be the US system, right? But when it's been clear that so many countries just have public spending on a public healthcare system that does work just because they put enough money into it, why fix it if the initial thing isn't broken? It's just being explicitly, meticulously and deliberately mismanaged so that we think that it's broken, right? To deliberately try and break it through policy rather than through any kind of innate nature of how the system actually works in the first place, right?
So that's my thoughts on the NHS. Please do get in touch if you agree with me, if you think the NHS needs more than just more cash, if it needs reform, if we need root and branch reform. Will that ever happen? Now it's Campus Clash. This is the time when we speak to two young people about an issue affecting their generation. This week it's housing and the cost of living crisis. Lots of people said the Queen's speech did nothing for young people. It did nothing for the housing crisis, which is making it very difficult for people to get on the housing ladder and to rent at a reasonable price. So are today's young people hard done by, having to work for decades to afford a house and with families unable to live on one income like their parents did, perhaps? Or are they in fact quite privileged, wining and dining, flying off on holiday and living far more comfortably by and large than previous generations did? Joining me now are politics students,
The former.
Nina Skinner and Jude Lavos. Thank you so much for joining me, guys. Nina, what do you think?
I follow Jude on TikTok. It's actually the reason why I ended up doing this segment in the first place, is I saw that they were on GB News on TikTok, and I was like, okay, let's go and let's have a look at this issue. I was already planning on doing a thing about think tank, like people who shape the news with think tanks and just cutting through specific people, just going after individuals, right? I was going to do one on Robert Colville to start with, but she came up and turns out she's part of a fucking free market think tank. Who fucking knew? And so yeah, let's go into this one.
Do you think young people are a little bit hard done by at the moment? You know, housing is through the roof. The cost of student fees seems to always be getting bigger and bigger, more and more money spent on getting a degree. Do you think the Queen's speech didn't do enough for young people?
Well, firstly, I want to acknowledge the problems that do exist. There is a major problem with insufficient supply, and the rate of the housing price increase is dramatic. However,
Okay, brilliant. So you've answered the question. The answer to the question is yes, young people are hard done by. Well done. There we go.
I don't think it's fair to say that the Queen's speech did nothing for young people. In the social housing sector, there have been promises of new powers given to the regulator to ensure that quality is sufficient. And in the private sector, they're introducing the Decent Home Standard, which is a legally binding.
That's not going to increase the supply. That's not going to change the distribution. Those are the two things that need to happen. The supply needs to increase and the distribution needs to be changed. Those are two things that need to happen, and that's not what making the houses better, which, to be fair, is a good thing, right? I mean, it's not something that should be debated, really. It's not something that should be happening now. That should be something that should have been part of, the law surrounding private rentals since time immemorial. We should always have had a policy with which homes should be, I don't know, fit for habitation, whether in the public or private sector, but I digress.
Requirement on private landlords to provide housing at a decent quality. So I don't think it's fair to say that nothing is being done for young people.
Jude.
I don't think nothing's being done for young people. Quite frankly, I do regard that the Queen's speech did have things that were good. The young people should take the pennies that are being tossed to them by this such gracious benevolence from Her Majesty's government.
Do you look to Sadiq Khan for some of your policy suggestions, perhaps? He's been saying that rent controls are a winner in London and that we should look at implementing them in the capital. What do you make of that? Do you think that's a good idea?
I think rent controls are a good idea, but they're not a solution to the entire problem. You know, millennials are spending about a quarter of their net earnings on rent when the people in the 80s would have been spending about 10%. So there's a problem with the prices they're being faced with. I think a rent control would help, but would it go a full way to fix the problem? Of course not. It's a good start, but there is a huge problem with, record low home owning, record high prices, the cost of living crisis, and I think the government's failure to address any of these properly is sort of showing in young people when they're trying to buy their first home.
Nina, I worry about this idea of rent controls getting more and more popular among young people.
I wonder why you might do. I wonder why you might be worried about something like rent controls. I wonder if there might be a partner of the hedge fund who owns GB News and pays your salary, who happens to have investments in real estate, and they're called KKR, and they're in a partnership with the hedge fund who owns GB News, and wouldn't you know it, they have vested interest in making sure the house prices keep going up because they're investments in real estate. Who fucking knew? What a surprise! Who could have possibly thought such a thing might happen, and why such a perspective might be being pushed onto us by people who are from a free market think tank to try and have an agenda which tries to tell us that nothing's wrong. It may be clear from literally every single piece of proper evidence, any proper kind of empirical understanding, any of the issues regarding the housing sector in this country. They've been continually done over and over and over and over and over again. But there's got to be another side. We've got to have a debate. We've got to be able to somehow have some kind of narrative on the other hand that might make people just completely disabuse themselves from the literal facts that are being presented to them on a platter by every single study that gets done on this issue.
Well, I think there was a poll out recently that showed that 80% of people, or 75%, a large amount of people in the capital think that rent controls are a good idea. And, I've done my research on this topic and I found that nowhere have they improved affordability and supply, because essentially you just have...
They have improved affordability. That's true. There is an issue, right? There is an issue with rent controls and supply, granted, because they stymie some level of private sector investment, right? Do you know what the solution to that is? The government builds houses. I know that's government do stuff, right? And government do stuff is when socialism, right? And I understand the Miss Person coming from free market think tank will not want us to think that maybe there is a solution outside of the private sector to deal with this issue, right? You say, well, if you engage in rent controls, then the private sector is not going to invest. I'm like, oh, the private sector isn't? Okay, interesting. That's interesting factoid that you have there about the private sector not caring about anything other than the profit motive and no actual utilitarian idea of the material reality of what's going to happen to people to improve their material conditions, right? It's funny that you might admit that about the private sector, but this is other part of the economy that I've just forgotten that we could use to artificially increase the supply to be able to drive prices down. I wonder what that might be. My head's empty, unfortunately. If the private sector won't do it, I guess we can't have rent controls, though. Case closed, Colombo.
Fewer landlords on the market, less supply. Surely the big issue here is planning reform. We need more houses built.
Absolutely, Emily, I agree with you 100%. All the evidence from the US where rent controls have been implemented relatively recently shows exactly that private buy-to-let landlords will, sell up to owner-occupiers.
Good. That's what we want. We want landlords to sell out to owner-occupiers. That doesn't change the supply issue, though. If someone is becoming an owner-occupier instead of a renter, they are not part of the consumer demographic that needs to apply for rental housing. It's one in, one out. The supply isn't changing, but the demand is changing, and it is literally one in, one out. It's a fixed that even if supply stays fixed, by moving someone from the rental sector to becoming an owner-occupier, that is better. Because it means someone is actually on the housing ladder rather than having some portion of their wages extorted from them. But that doesn't. The demand will shrink with the supply as well because it's literally one in, one out. As Andy quite rightly points out in the chat, that's what houses are for. Living in, not using as a speculative investment. But unfortunately, the speculative investment is what's paying this person's bills. Right? Literally, her bills are paid by people who have a vested interest in the price of housing continually increasing. Simple. Problem with just build my houses is don't address the underlying issues in the market. Those houses will all be unaffordable for the vast majority of people. That's true because the money is not in affordable housing. The money is in the housing that is for well-off people, right? So that's what the market is not going to fulfill the needs of the supply of the demand rather. Sorry, because it's not as financially viable as constraining the supply artificially to make sure that people who are on the lowest wages are fighting over the scraps that are available at the bottom end, which aren't getting built and developed properly. And to poor standards, might I also remind everybody that the private sector has continually missed standards with regards to the actual structural integrity of housing that's being built. These are not good quality houses, right? They may pass whatever low bar the government's fit for human habitation, but as far as actual proper property investments going, they're not good. They don't compare to the council houses of yesteryear, like the ones I live in right now. They're incredibly structurally sound because unfortunately, when the public sector does something, it actually gets done to a proper standard because, otherwise the councillors end up losing their seats at the next election, right? Simple. There's proper actual feedback from a democratically accountable public sector. Unfortunately, which isn't there with a private sector that is only care is the profit motive. Their only thing is the fiduciary responsibility for generating shareholder profits. It's very, very simple. And you need to build specific types of housing, and that is high density, tower blocks and high mid-rise housing to be able to massively inflate the supply to drop housing prices. I'm like, people say, but no justice. What happens to all the people who've taken out mortgages? Tough. I have a mortgage. I don't give a shit. I do not care if I lose the equity on this house. I do not give a shit in the slightest. Tank the market. I don't care. There are people on the street. There are people being eviscerated financially by landlords as rents continue to go up during cost of living crisis. I'm beyond the point of caring at this point, right? Something needs to happen, something needs to drastically happen. And if that means outlawing landlords, if that means building massively overinflating the supply of housing by building lots and lots of high density housing that increases the supply, and almost certainly will cause landlords to get out of the business as well, leaving more space for more owner occupiers. Whereas if you do the opposite there, where you artificially constrain the supply by leaving it highly over commodified in the hands of the private sector, they will continue to want to contract the availability of properties to be able to buy for owner occupiers. It's very, very simple, and that's why actually rent controls are would absolutely be a good thing, as long as they are done in conjunction with a public policy of local authority house building, because unfortunately that's what used to be the case. We were building hundreds of thousands of local authority houses, council houses, before the 80s, before the advent of neoliberalism. What this fucker on the screen right now explicitly says it's a good thing that we stopped building those council houses. Do you know how many council houses were built in 2004 under a Labour government, mind you? 104. Literally 1,000 times fewer houses were built in 2004 than in 1974. It's preposterous, and it's led to the housing crisis that we have right now, as well as right to buy, all those other things that took things out of the public sector, which is there explicitly to regulate this fucking Wild West market of private landlords and private equity firms who do nothing. They don't do any work. They sit on their fucking ass, taking the money that we work hard for, right? That we work hard for every day. That gets siphoned off of us for nothing because they own shit, right? Simple.
Which may help young people buy houses, and that there are slightly more houses on the market, but it won't help people, who are first moving out of their parents' house, people with, less income who realistically have to be renting.
So if the rents go down because of caps, that doesn't help the people who are just coming out of their parents' houses. You listening to the words that you're saying?
Reform, also, you've definitely mentioned. I was personally disappointed by the Queen's speech, and that I don't think that enough was done. But if any government is going to help us on the issue of planning reform, it's going to be a Conservative government, which has a, albeit somewhat vague and watered down, ideological commitment to deregulation.
I mean, I wonder what deregulation might be a buzzword that they're particularly interested in. I mean, to be fair, I do think there needs to be some kind of level of planning reform, right? But unfortunately, the planning reform is not being done in such a way to be able to, to court the YIMBY vote, such and such. It's being done with which to be able to pour more and more money into the hands of the very few private developers that ever get the permission to be able to build in these areas, right? And they don't. And again, only 10% of new builds end up being affordable. So it doesn't actually properly increase the supply of low cost housing that we actually need to deal with the housing crisis that we have right now. The deregulation will not help. It has to be the public sector, because those are the only people with a vested interest in making sure that the prices are low enough for people to be able to get on the housing ladder. It has to be done from the public sector. It just does. It's very, very simple.
Jude, do you think, this is a little bit of a tricky question perhaps, do you think young people are a little bit entitled? I speak to my parents and they tell me that when they had a mortgage, their interest rates were 15%, they didn't go on holidays, they didn't go out for meals like young people do quite a lot of. Do you think that there's a tendency for some young people to moan a bit too much?
I would like to say that the complete opposite is true. It's the absolute complete opposite is the reality of what's happened. It's the boomers who are entitled. They feel entitled to their house price to continually go up year after year after year for the pittance that they bought it in the 70s, 80s and 90s, right? Then they expect us to have to tie in our wallets to deal with the fact that they are the ones who reaped the benefits of the sell-off of public assets during the Thatcher era, right? Then they try and turn around to us and tell us we're entitled for wanting the basic necessities that they were afforded, essentially for the entirety of the social democratic consensus in the post-war period. And we're the ones that are entitled? Absolute nonsense. Not true in the slightest.
I completely disagree. If you look at the average house price compared to salary 20 years ago, if you look at the average salary, house prices are about 4 times that for the average house and the average salary. Now it's about 8 times that. So you've had an almost double in price in the housing market, but wages haven't followed. So of course, young people go out to eat and buy these luxuries that they like to enjoy. But if we didn't do those things, it wouldn't mean we'd suddenly be able to magically afford a house. There's still a huge problem where houses are becoming increasingly unaffordable and wages aren't following.
And the other issue as well is, right, so there's 2 things I want to add to what Pick and Tea Break said here, is that the first is, So when we're talking about the idea of a high interest rate mortgage, which is it is true, like the interest rates on mortgages were very, very high in the early years of what I was talking about previously within the post-war consensus, right? Mortgages did have high interest rates, but they were affordable to get on at the start. The deposits were lower, but they did have a higher rate of interest. But it doesn't really matter if you can't afford the deposit in the first place because of the cost of living crisis and because of the massively inflated house prices as well, right? If you cannot get on the first rung to be able to get the deposit in the first place, what the interest rate is, it does not matter in the slightest. Because at the end of the day, whether you're having a low interest rate and you're paying £350,000 for a £300,000 house, or whether you're paying £600,000 house, £600,000 for a £300,000 house at the end of the time after a high interest rate mortgage, it doesn't. If your only other option was renting, that doesn't make a difference because you're going to spend that money anyway. Mortgages a lot of the time are cheaper than the monthly payments that you have for rent, regardless, especially nowadays when rents are so high. But as long as you've built up, as long as you've accrued some level of capital over the course of that home ownership, whether you've paid over the odds for the initial house price or not, either of those situations is still better than renting. And the issue that we have at the moment is not an issue of the affordability of mortgage payments. It's an issue with the affordability of the initial deposit because of the massive skyrocketing house price at the start of it, right? So the issue that we have at the moment is interest rates are so low on mortgages, right? And they have been for an incredibly long time. Is that it's been continually used as a speculative investment for landlords, for people who are not owner-occupiers, who are not using the house for their own use, for its actual use value, which is a place to live, they're then continually using that as an excuse to be able to continue to accrue more and more inventory of their property portfolio, because it's very, very easy to make extra money, because the interest rates of the mortgage payment are so low, that the overall cost is going to be much lower than it otherwise would be. So it makes it a very lucrative investment. Whereas if the interest rates on mortgages were higher, it would be much more difficult to then turn a profit. So people would be less likely to increase their property portfolio over and over and over again and become, full-time landlords or being the private equity sector who buy up whole villages of houses get bought up by private investment firms. Because, I guess they're buying with cash flow all the time, but even so, even if it was just paying with mortgages, they can do so and then use that for profit. Whereas if you make it far less incentivized for someone who's using it as a speculative investment, but make it such that the prices are low enough that people can get on the housing ladder to start with, to be able to get out of renting, that's the perfect place to be. So I actually support an increase in mortgage interest, because overall, using that dynamic to decrease house prices overall so it makes it easier to get onto the housing ladder to start with is a much fairer system than it is at the moment, where people who have all of the wealth get to hoard all the houses, and people with none of the wealth can't even get on the ladder to begin with. As far as I'm concerned, there's no utility to the way we have it currently. But obviously, in a ideal world, I would just ban landlords altogether, just completely completely nationalize it or whatever. But I don't think that's the world that we live in right now. So for the policies that we should pass, that's fair enough. And also, the second point I was going to make too is that when people come and say, "Oh well, young people are so entitled," when I was your age, we never went on foreign holidays. We never had gadgets like iPhones. As if consumer electronics and holidays aren't cheaper than they've literally ever been, which is not something that we did. It's not something that we lobbied for or anything like that. Anything that we explicitly tried to take advantage of. How cheap it is to be able to get things like consumer electronics, or go on holidays. But it costs more to pay a month rent than it is to go and have a week's break in fucking Mallorca or something. The issue that we have isn't with whether or not the additional stuff that we can do, because luxury commodities are cheaper than they've ever been. Because boomers can still go on holidays, right? They can still spend their money on these cheap commodities too. But we also cannot have the necessities, because food prices are massively skyrocketing, house prices are completely unaffordable, and the energy prices, that's also really high as well. It's almost like these inelastic markets that should be in the purview of the public sector to make sure that they're available for everybody, putting them into the hands of the private sector has just made them increasingly unaffordable, because all we do is subsidize with our own wages the the shareholder dividends of of the richest companies in the world. It makes no fucking sense, and that's why the things that are necessary for everybody are sky high in price at the moment, and the things that are luxuries that we don't need but aren't necessities are incredibly low cost at the moment, because otherwise, people wouldn't consume in those markets. We are forced to consume in the necessities market, which is why it makes sense from a market-driven perspective to drive those prices up. And I don't know about anybody else watching this right now, but I would much rather have cheap necessities than having cheap luxuries, because we have to pay for them at the end of the day. Simple as that.
Just sorry, though, we just got a short moment left. Nina, just a last word to you. What would you have liked to see in the Queen's speech that would have really made a good impact for young people?
Well, I would have liked to see a massive commitment to roll back the Greenbelt. We have areas that are 10 miles from city centres which you're not allowed to build on because there's a derelict petrol station. It makes absolutely no sense, and that's the only way that we're going to build new houses.
Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me. Really appreciate you giving...
High rises. Build high-density housing. Simple. It is what it is. There we go. And I would highly recommend everyone follow Pig and Tea Break on TikTok. I don't know how I'm going to fucking edit this for TikTok after this segment's done, but I digress anyway.
Up your time on a Sunday afternoon. Thanks a lot. That was politics students Nina Skinner and Jude Lavos, weren't they? Great. I thought they were great.
Exactly, and it's the same with regards to market elasticity with regards to healthcare. Like, when you look at something like America or whatever, if it's something that you need to live, you're going to pay an amount of money for it. It's why trans people have to pay so much for private healthcare currently, because it's something that we need to be able to live, because unfortunately, we're not supposed to kill ourselves. So, like, it's just so unfortunately, but these free marketers, they just, for some reason, people who try and tell these free market like dogmatists who try and kind of come across to us like they're economics experts, right? They spend their lives doing economics. They should be the economic experts that should be able to want to influence policy platforms, to influence the dialogue around economic policy, etc., etc. It's funny how these are the ones who seem to forget incredibly basic things like market elasticity when they're talking about things that, if they understood the level of market elasticity, would understand why they push for these things, because it financially benefits the people right at the top of society, the oligarchs who fund their programs, right? And fund news channels like this. At the end of the day, it's clear why they have a vested interest in making the rich richer and keeping the poor poor, is because that is the people who pay their bills. If the money that was spent by these hedge funds on things like think tanks, on things like GB News, if these didn't push narratives that increase their profit line, they would not be doing their fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. It's very, very simple. So, what's going to happen? They're going to push narratives that are going to be able to be favourable for their own business interests. And unfortunately, no matter what these people will tell you, no matter what lies and nonsense and twists of logic these people will tell you, the interests of you as a consumer and them as the oligarchs are completely divergent. These are two disparate classes who have completely different material interests, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. Ignore them. They're lying to you to take your money and to make your life worse. And that is why I would call this person a thinkwank. Anyway, if you're enjoying this on YouTube after my incredibly slapdash approach to editing this particular video, please consider liking and subscribing. If you click the bell, it will notify you when I go live on YouTube. I know this was only streamed on Twitch, but I digress. If you click on my name, you can go watch another video. And also please follow me on Twitch. The link is in the description. Thank you very much, guys, and I'll see you next time.